So this is a presentation about the school funding formula. It's framed and prepared for a presentation to Belmont Town Meeting, but I'm going to talk through it in a way that is general and relates to all three of the communities that I represent, Belmont, Watertown, and Boston. First of all, how does the education aid formula work? It's basically simple conceptually. First of all, calculate the foundation budget, which is basically how much does each community need, or each school district need, to meet the needs of its children. And that's a very complex calculation, big spreadsheet with lines and columns for each of the different components of cost and reflecting special needs, English language learning costs, and the needs of the economically disadvantaged communities and economically disadvantaged students. So that's a number as to how much the state thinks it should cost each community to educate their students. That's step one. Step two is calculate the local contribution. In other words, decide how much the community can afford to pay. And that's basically a relatively straightforward computation based on the income and property wealth of the community. Finally, the state's going to make up the difference between what the community needs to spend and what the community can afford to spend. There's some wrinkles around that, but that's the basic computation. Now, those numbers turn out to vary widely from community to community. Some communities like Lawrence, the state pays almost the whole cost of educating the students. In a number of more affluent communities, the formula would dictate no contribution from the state, but in a political compromise, the higher income communities across the state do receive 17.5% of the cost of the foundation budget, that basic estimate of educating their children. Now, the problem that is preoccupying legislators at this time is that the foundation budget significantly underestimates actual costs. So that, for example, on a statewide basis, taking all the community school districts together, health insurance costs are understated by about $1.5 billion. And similarly, special education costs are underestimated by about $1 billion. So recognition of that reality is especially of concern as it relates to lower income communities. A community like Chelsea basically is unable to spend more than its foundation budget, unable to spend more than the state, than its limited resources are able to provide together with the state contribution. And so that community, since the foundation budget is understated, is really likely to be not paying enough, not doing enough for education. Now, there are the communities that look like Chelsea are mostly the big cities, not Boston, which has a great tax base, but Fall River, Brockton, Lawrence, Lowell, Worcester. Those communities are all spending very close to their foundation budget and therefore are not spending enough since the foundation budget is an understatement of costs. Other communities like Watertown are spending much more than their foundation budget, so they are spending an amount that's adequate to provide for their children. So there's a block of children in the state who are not receiving an adequate education. Now, those concerns led to the creation of the Foundation Budget Review Commission in 2014, and that commission recommended that 4 areas of the foundation budget needed to be adjusted: health insurance, special education, English language learners, and most importantly, economically disadvantaged students. So that's what we're working on this year, is to develop some kind of phased-in model for implementing those recommendations. There is a lot of consensus about the first 3. The last one, there's a huge consensus that there's a need, but the magnitude of that need is not agreed. Reasonable people can disagree how much is necessary to spend to try to close that achievement gap between the lower performing districts and the higher performing districts. I'm going to talk about Belmont, and Boston, and Watertown. Belmont has a relatively large school-age population, both compared to the state and compared to the other 2 communities that I represent, Boston and Watertown. What is striking is how low Boston and Watertown are in terms of their share of kids that are in the community. This is the kids age 5 to 17 as a percentage of the total population. So what that means is those communities have relatively more resources in relation to their school population. So, I mean, Belmont is a relatively affluent community, more affluent than Belmont and Watertown, Boston and Watertown, which are in turn still more affluent than the state. But when you set that up next to foundation budget, since Belmont has so many more kids, Belmont looks a lot like Boston in terms of its ability to fund education. Watertown stands out as having a really high ability to fund education. And at the presentation we attended, that we held at the Alston Honan Library last week, we heard a very different flavor from each of the three communities. Belmont is really squeezing to pay costs and doing without many things that are present in other school systems. Watertown is making decisions about how to strengthen its education, how to add resources where it would make most sense to do so. And Boston's in an intermediate place. Because they have a much smaller population proportionally, they're able to spend much more per student, but that spending still leaves many teachers and parents feeling that the spending is inadequate. This shows the per pupil spending across the three communities. The thing to highlight about Boston is that it has much greater share of its students with some form of identified need, whether it's English language learning, a disability, or whether they're economically disadvantaged. The economically disadvantaged share is much greater in Boston and somewhat less, really much less in Belmont as relates to the state. Watertown is about average by those measures. So here's a chart showing that speaks to the question, how would the changes affect Belmont? What this chart actually shows is the growth of school spending in Belmont, and the blue hatched bars are the foundation budget, sort of never quite, always being less than the actual amount of school spending. Now, I've seen a number of different models about how much the proposed changes to the foundation budget will affect the aid available to each community. The short version of that story is it's a story that you can tell with some confidence for Belmont, because Belmont has a relatively small share of low income or economically disadvantaged students, and that is the area where there's a lack of consensus at this point. The numbers are relatively clear for the other categories, healthcare and special education, and to a lesser extent for English language learners, of which there are many in Belmont. But it's safe to say that Belmont's foundation budget will go up by about 20 to 25%, which is about the right amount of growth to bring those blue bars up to, bring the blue bars up to the solid bar there. So that's what we hope will happen over a period of years that is not yet defined. In Boston, the numbers are still very uncertain. I could show a chart like this for Boston, but how I could characterize the foundation budget changing, or rather the net state aid changing, is more complicated for a couple of reasons. In Boston, the state aid is grandfathered or held harmless at a level that's above the level dictated by the formula, so that in order for Boston to see really big results, it needs to see a much larger increase in state aid. And that will determine what the big variable there is, what assumptions are made or what adjustments are made for low-income children in the formula. Watertown, less uncertain than Boston, but also somewhat uncertain. Certainly looking at a decent increase in the same, probably of a magnitude similar to, but greater than Boston, Belmont. So here's my commitment as a legislator is to increasing school funding. It's always been a central goal of mine. That's why I got into politics initially as a local official. In 2020, we hope to make sure we fund the special education circuit breaker fully, as we have in a number of years. And we also want to make a down payment on the implementation of the Foundation Budget Review Commissions. The Senate budget includes a seventh, which is about a 5.3% increase for Belmont. Later this year, we hope to get the Foundation Budget Review Commissions into law, and in subsequent years, the challenge will be to fully fund those recommendations, and that may depend on the statewide ballot question in 2022. So, eager to hear questions from folks. You know where to reach me. Click the contact link, and or just comment on this page.